Our next speaker I met at Steve Martin's house, of all places. Alison Gopnik and I belong to this sort of informal little, it's called a philosophy society or group or whatever it's called, but it's really a bunch of scientists mostly that just hang around once a year, a couple times a year at people's houses and just talk about interesting things. So this is where I met her, and she gave this interesting presentation. Everybody gives just a little 5 or 10 minute blip. Alison is the really one of the world's leading researchers on the subject of how brains develop and grow, in the sense of children developing the sense of thinking, understanding, causality, critical thinking, science. Really, I mean, it's really how to train a kid to become a scientist in a way is what she does. She studies at UC Berkeley. She studies cognitive development in her lab, research on cognition, brain and behavior, theory of mind, psychology and philosophy, how children develop and change intuitive theories of the world, much the same way that scientists do, and some ways that they don't. Children's causal knowledge and causal learning across domains, including physical, biological, and psychological knowledge. In essence, how the brain learns to think. She's an international leader in the field of children's learning and was one of the first cognitive scientists to show how developmental psychology could be used to answer some ancient philosophical problems. She's a co-author of the book Words, Thoughts, and Theories, and the book that we have here, because it's a terrific book, The Scientist in the Crib, Minds, Brains, and How Children Learn. With that, please help me welcome Dr. Alison Gopnik.
Going to ask if I can get this. Is this working? Yes? Great. Now, is it going to wake up? There we go. Great. Okay, first of all, many thanks to Michael for inviting me and to all of you for being here. I guess I'll have to be here to click this. I study brains, but I study them actually in living, moving, breathing children. And what I'm going to do today is talk about some research and some ideas that we've had about how studying children in particular can help us to understand how science works, how thinking about science can help us to understand how children work, and about how thinking about both science and children can help us to understand deep things about how human beings work, even some things about how our consciousness works. And all the work I'm going to talk about today is in collaboration with my brilliant student Laura Schultz, who's now at MIT, and in fact with a philosopher who really studies science and pays attention to it and changes his mind as a result, Clark Leamore at Carnegie Mellon University. Okay. So it might seem very bizarre to think about children and scientists in the same breath. If you had asked people even 30 years ago about children, let alone a couple of hundred years ago, what you would have heard, the old story, was that babies and young children in particular are, as the great philosopher John Locke said, blank slates. They live in a blooming, buzzing confusion, as the great psychologist William James said. And even the great founder of developmental psychology, Jean Piaget, thought that babies and young children were egocentric and irrational and pre-causal. So they weren't actually capable of thinking rationally, figuring out what was going on around them in a systematic kind of way. And as I say, 30 years ago, that was the common wisdom about babies and young children. People even said that babies were decorticate. They were sort of like crying carrots, vegetables that could not do very much more than make a lot of noise. So you might think, well, what on earth could those creatures, and even 3- and 4-year-olds people thought were just these kind of fuzzy-headed, imaginative, creative, but incapable of, but deeply, deeply irrational creatures. You might think, what on earth could those kinds of creatures tell you about science or thought? Well, the last 30 years have completely overturned our views about babies and young children. It turns out that literally newborn babies, even the very, very youngest children, already think about the world, understand about the world, have abstract pictures of what the world is like. And even very young children already, like scientists, are figuring things out about the world. They have theories about the world. They test those theories. They do experiments. They change the theories in the light of what they find out about the world. So we've really completely changed over the last 30 years our view about what babies and young children are like. And every study that we do, every year, every week, there's some new finding that shows us that babies know much more and learn much more than we ever would have thought was possible. So I've called this new view about babies the theory, because the idea is that babies and young children are actually making up theories about the world in very much the same way that scientists make up theories about the world. And over the last 30 years, we've traced the way that babies and young children make up theories about the physical world around them. They learn about things like gravity and support and the physical relationships among objects. They make up theories about biology. Even 3- and 4-year-olds are starting to understand things about genetics, about the idea that traits can be inherited, that things can grow, that things can get sick. And importantly, they make up theories about other people's minds. So a lot of my earlier work was on what's called theory of mind or folk psychology, where even 2-year-olds, 18-month-olds, 10-month-olds are starting to make up theories about how other people's minds work. Now, so that's a quick summary of 30 years of research in cognitive development. But of course, it's very puzzling, right? I mean, why would it be that these very small children would apparently have such incredible intellectual capacities? Why is it that they would be making up these theories and showing these really phenomenal abilities to make inferences, create theories from what they see about the world? And I want to suggest what I'll call an evolutionary not-so-just-so story. There are a lot of evolutionary just-so stories out there. I'm extremely pleased to see that Roger Bingham has been cured of his susceptibility to them. But one of the things, what makes something not be just a just-so story? Well, one thing is if you can look across lots and lots of different species and see the same pattern. So it's not just something where you say, well, human beings are like this, so they must have evolved to be like this, but a case where you can actually see similar patterns of evolution across many, many different species. So here's the particular evolutionary just-so story, or not-so-just-so story, that I want to talk about. If you look across many, many different kinds of species of animals, look at different kinds of birds, different kinds of rodents, different kinds of mammals, you see a very interesting pattern. Some species within a general group seem to be more flexible, capable of learning more, able to exist in more different environments than others, what we anthropocentrically perhaps would call the smarter species. So ravens, which I'm just starting to study, are very, very smart birds. Rats are very smart rodents. Chimps and monkeys are very smart mammals, and so forth. And if you look at those members of those families and compare them to other species, you see that some other kinds of things seem to go along with that greater degree of intelligence. It turns out that the more intelligent species also are more likely to eat lots of different kinds of food. They're more likely to be polygamous. They're more likely to engage in a range of sexual behaviors. And their babies are likely to be immature for substantially longer than the babies of related but less intelligent species. Now, why is it that all those things, passing quickly over polygamy, would go together? And if you think, of course, about human beings, again, passing quickly over polygamy, we're way out on the end of the spectrum on all of those dimensions. So we're smarter, we're more flexible, we live in more different environments, we eat more different kinds of food, we have sex more different kinds of ways. And our babies, let me tell you as a mother of a 26-year-old, are immature and dependent on us for much longer than the babies of any other species. As I also point out, of course, at Berkeley, where I come from, we're even further out on the distribution on all of these measures than people in other places, even Southern California. Now, why would that be? Why would we see this correlation between being smart and being immature? Well, if you think about it for a minute, you can see why it might be. Some animals seem to have an evolutionary strategy of having instincts that are beautifully adapted for particular niches. Those are the kind of evolutionary psychology animals. But other species, like us, seem to have a different evolutionary strategy. We're designed not to be very good at doing anything in particular, but to be extremely good at learning about whatever environment it is that you put us in. And if you think that that's our evolutionary strategy, it's a great strategy. It's the strategy that's allowed us to conquer the world and even go into outer space. But it has one big disadvantage, which is that while the charging mastodon is coming towards you, you don't really want to be sitting there thinking, what is this? A mastodon? Does it charge? What am I supposed to do about it? And the way that nature seems, so you don't want to actually have to be learning and applying what you learn at the same time. And the way that nature seems to have solved that problem is by inventing babies. So babies and young children are people who don't have to do anything. Everything that they actually have to do is done by us. We're the ones who actually fend off the charging mastodons and find the peanut butter sandwiches and do all the things that they need for survival. All babies and young children have to do is learn. So the idea is that we have this period of protected immaturity where we don't have to do anything in particular, but we do have to learn everything about the world around us. And once we've used that period of childhood to learn all the things that we need to learn, then when we become adults, we can actually put all that learning to use to do all the boring things that we have to do to survive and reproduce. Well, maybe not that boring, but... So that's the picture. The picture is that babies and young children are essentially the R&D unit of the human species, right? We have to do the marketing and the selling and the manufacturing. They're the blue sky types who can just sit and figure out wonderful new ideas about how things should work. And if you think about the babies as being the R&D unit, then it's not perhaps so surprising that they should empirically turn out to have these incredible capacities for learning about the world around them. It makes a lot of sense that they're really designed, more than anything else, to make up theories, to figure out what the particular environment in which they find themselves is like. And in fact, we've suggested that this helps to explain another very puzzling thing, which is, why is it that human beings should have the capacity for science at all? I mean, we've only been using it in a systematic way for the last 400 years or so. And as Michael, I'm sure, can testify, it sometimes seems like most of us don't use this capacity at all. So why would it be? I mean, after all, even the greatest scientists have brains just like the rest of us. Why would our brains have evolved to do something that we seem to do only so recently and even so infrequently? And what we've suggested is that those capacities didn't develop for us to do science, they developed for us to be children. So the picture is not that children are little scientists, it's that scientists are big children. A few of us, when we're put in the same privileged position as babies, namely that we have nothing to do and we're taken care of and indulged and get to just play all the time, until very recently also had women who took care of all of our everyday needs. When we're put in that same position that babies are, we're actually capable of using some of these capacities that babies just automatically use all the time. And what we call science is the use in adults of these capacities for learning, for theory formation, for understanding the world, that were, from an evolutionary perspective, designed for children. So the view here is that science is a kind of epiphenomena of childhood. By the way, I've often talked about this with philosophers of science and so forth, and one of them called it the thesis that defies credulity. So they don't think very much about it. But I've also given this talk to scientists, to people at the Fermi Labs and at the Lawrence Labs, and they think that this is transparently obvious. So as soon as I say the thing about scientists being children, they all laugh and applaud and completely agree. Okay. If that hypothesis is correct, that in fact, in science, what we're doing is using these mechanisms, and if it's also, the theory is correct, that what children are doing is using some of the same mechanisms that we see in science, that's a nice first start. But of course, what we really would like to know is, okay, so what are those mechanisms? If what children are doing is like what scientists are doing and vice versa, exactly what is it that our brains are doing? Exactly what kinds of computations are we performing that let us do the kinds of things that we see in science and childhood? What kinds of computations, what kind of a computer inside of our brain could actually accomplish the things, the kinds of learning that we see all the time in children and sometimes in science? So the question is, how does science work from a computational perspective? And if you had asked philosophers of science that question, indeed if you did when you were, say, a young philosophy graduate student, as I was 30 years ago, they would have said, well, we don't really have any idea. You'll have to ask the psychologists. It's something, I don't know, there's powerful ones, there's not powerful ones, there's paradigm shifts, something happens to make science work, but we don't really know very much about it. Fortunately, in the past 15 years or so, there's been tremendous work in the philosophy of science, in statistics and computer science, which is actually telling us something about how science might work. And the basic idea is that you could think about science as a system for recovering the causal structure of the world, figuring out what the causal structure of the world is like, figuring out how some things make other things happen. Science does other things as well, but that's at least one very central thing that it does. And in terms of what Christophe was saying, you could think about it as being kind of like our visual system. Our visual system is designed to figure out the spatial structure of the world. There's a world out there, it's got 3 dimensions, it's got objects, and somehow our visual system has to take the information in our retina and reconstruct the spatial structure of the world. That's what we do when we look at the world. Well, you could think of science as being a similar kind of process, but a process that instead of uncovering the spatial structure of the world, instead of figuring out where things are, figures out how things work, figures out what out in the world causes something else, what makes other things happen. And often, what are the invisible things, the things we can't even see, that are making all sorts of other things happen. That's really what science is all about. So that's the suggestion that I'm going to make. That's the deep cognitive basis of science. And that's what little children are doing from the time they're born. That's what they care about more than anything else. Figuring out how things, people, objects, animals work. How do we do that? Well, there's 2 things that we do. One thing that we do is we actually do experiments. So we make interventions in the world, we do things in the world, and then we see what the consequences of those things are. What are the events going to be that will follow on our interventions on the world? And the other thing that we do is we do statistics. So what we do is we make those interventions, we see what happens, and then we look at the complicated patterns of dependence and independence among the events that follow from our interventions. So it isn't enough just to do experiments. That's a good thing to do. What you really need to do, though, is to know whether what came out of your experiment really is telling you something about causal structure, or if it's just telling you about coincidences or correlations. And it's that combination of being able to do experiments and to do statistical analyses of the dependencies among events. Those 2 things together give us the great power of science to figure out the causal structure of the world. So you could think of us as scientists. What we do is we do experiments, we look at what happens when we intervene on the world, we analyze the dependencies among events, and lo and behold, we figure out something about what causes what. And then we can use that information to send rockets to the moon and find a cure for AIDS and all the other great things that we do as scientists. What's happened over the last 15 years, as I say, is that people in philosophy of science, in computer science, and statistics have started actually giving a formal computational account of how those kinds of inferences are possible. How we could get from evidence of experiments and interventions and statistical evidence about the dependencies of events to normatively, accurately, veridically uncover the causal structure of the world. Just like we can take the information in our retina and normatively, veridically, accurately uncover the spatial structure of the world. And we're starting to figure out computationally how we can actually design systems that can do this. And my favorite, the systems are called causal Bayes nets, and my favorite application is that one of them is actually, a system like this is actually going up with the Mars robots in, I guess, 2012, which is the next robot. And what it's going to do is actually allow those little robots to actually do the science right up there on Mars and send us back the scientific conclusions instead of having to send us back the evidence. Now, what does all this have to do with children? Well, you think about those Mars robots. They're an awful lot like toddlers, right? Basically, they toddle around. They're always getting into things. The people on Earth are always having to pick them up again and fix them and take care of them and put Band-Aids on them. What we want to suggest is that actually toddlers are that kind of robot. What we want to suggest is that babies and young children are designed by evolution to be these fantastic, fabulous causal inference mechanisms. They're little engines, little machines that are designed to go around the world and figure out the causal structure of the world. That's what they're there for. And if that's true, they might be using some of the same kinds of computations as these robotic systems and that we implicitly use when we're doing science. They might actually be doing experiments and doing statistical analyses of those experiments to find out the truth. Now, how can we find out whether this is true? Well, we're talking about 3- and 4-year-olds here, so we can't actually ask them whether they understand experimental design or whether they can analyze statistics. But what we can do is we can do something a bit like Christoph's perceptual illusions. What we can do is we can actually give them new causal problems to solve. We can sort of put them on Mars, say, okay, I want you to figure this out. And we can give them different kinds of patterns of evidence about those problems, and we can see what conclusions they draw. And that's what we've been doing in my lab for the last five years or so. Let me give you an example of how this is possible. Suppose, for instance, I show you a machine like this. When we do this with the babies, you'll see in a minute, it's actually a square box, and it has 2 little gears on the top, and it has a switch, right? Looks very simple. Here's what happens. I flick the switch, and the gears spin together. And then I flick the switch back, and they stop. I flick the switch again, and they spin together, and I switch it off, and they stop. Now, that might seem like that's such an incredibly simple system. What's there to find out about? Well, actually, even that incredibly simple machine turns out to have lots of causal possibilities. So it could be that the switch is making the yellow wheel spin, which is making the blue wheel spin. Or it could be the switch is making the blue wheel spin, which is making the yellow wheel spin. Or it could be the switch makes them both spin independently. Or it could even be that you need both of them to spin, that the switch plus one gear makes the other spin, and the switch plus the other gear makes the blue one spin. So even with this simple system, there's lots of causal possibilities. How could you figure out which one of these is right? If you're a little causal inference engine, you want to try and figure out what the truth is about this machine. So here's something you could do. You can't do it just by looking at the wheels spin. But what you could do is you could take off the blue wheel and now flick the switch and see what happens to the yellow wheel. And then, sorry, this is missing a little piece. And then what you could do is do the opposite. What you could do is you could take off the blue wheel and see what happens, take off the yellow wheel and see what happens when you spin the blue wheel. So in this case, what happens is you take off the blue wheel and the yellow wheel spins, and you take off the yellow wheel and the blue wheel does not spin. Okay, everybody got that? Well, that pattern of evidence can actually tell you what the right answer is. So if you see that pattern of evidence, you know that the structure has to be that the switch made the yellow wheel spin, which made the blue wheel spin, right? So if you take off the blue wheel and the yellow wheel spins, but you take off the yellow wheel and the blue wheel doesn't spin, then formally it has to be that second pattern. So there's a kind of causal logic that's involved here. So what we know is that looking at these complicated patterns about what happens when we intervene, looking at this kind of statistics of the results of our experiment can tell us the causal structure of this machine. Okay, so the question is, all right, I hope, an audience full of brilliant, scientifically sophisticated people like this can solve this kind of problem. But could very young children who've never done a science experiment in their life also solve this problem? Can they use statistics and experiments to figure out the structure of causal events? What we did was do exactly what we just did with you, except do it with a bunch of 4-year-olds. There's some details about this, but that I won't go into. But essentially what we did was we showed the children different patterns of evidence, the patterns of evidence that I showed you before. And then we simply gave them those little pictures that you just saw, and we said, tell us, how does the machine work? Is it yellow, the switch making yellow go, which is making blue go, or is it both, or whatever? Just show me the picture that says how this machine works. And what we discovered was that the children, these are 4-year-olds, were incredibly good at solving this problem. In fact, they were all systematically on all of these patterns, if you gave them the right pattern of evidence, they would draw the right conclusion about the causal structure. Moreover, we could do it the other way around. So we could actually get them to predict. If we showed them the picture and we said, look, this is how it works, what will happen if I do this experiment? What will happen if I take the blue one off and flick the switch? Will the yellow one go or will the yellow one not go? Again, even very young children, even these 4-year-olds, were extremely good at making these kinds of predictions. So conclusions, even very young children, even 4-year-olds, were using patterns of experimental intervention and statistics in a very, very sophisticated way. Remember, these are kids who are not reading yet, in a very, very sophisticated way, but a practical way to try and solve these causal problems. Now, of course, you might say, well, that's true, but after all, we were doing the experiments. It wasn't that they were doing the experiments. We were doing the experiments and then trying to see what kinds of conclusions they would draw. And by the way, everything I've shown you is exactly what's predicted by the formal computational account of causal inference that I talked about before. Could children actually discover some of these things themselves if they didn't have us developmental psychologists asking them the questions? And to try to do that, what we did was we simply gave the children the box. And we said, okay, figure out how this works. Now, we should emphasize that children, as you'll see, are not exactly controlled experimenters. So let's, oops. Let me show you what they actually did, I hope. Yes. I think this is the largest these children have ever been, so I hope you can hear it. So here's some of the things that they did. Okay, as Laura Schultz, who did these experiments, always said, you wouldn't be laughing like this if this was your thesis data. So what it shows you is that children very spontaneously, and we could just show these kinds of films for hours, as soon as they get this kind of problem, are trying to do all these things to figure it out, many of which are completely useless and aren't going to help. But in addition to doing those things, here's something else that the children did. I hope. Wow, he says. And he says, I wonder how. And he says, the crank's over here, and actually solves the problem at the end. And what we've discovered is that we've now done this, at the time of this slide, we had done this, with 9 children. We've now done this with 20 children. Out of 20 pairs of children, 19 of them, in the space of 4 minutes, figured out the answer to this problem. And they did that just as a result of their kind of spontaneous interventions. A little thing that I wanted to say is that we often, in terms of neuroscience, people often talk about babies and young children as being sort of defective grown-ups. So they often point out that the children don't have a developed frontal lobe. My teenage son points this out many, many times, which means that they're not as capable of control and of inhibition and so forth as adults are. But if you think about this kind of task, that lack of control and inhibition may be beautifully designed for children to actually be great causal inference engines. The fact that the children get into everything, the fact that they can't see something without trying every possible kind of intervention, without trying every experiment that you can imagine, the fact that they do it over and over and over again and you can't get them away from it, that may be a very bad thing for a grown-up to do, but it may be exactly what you want a Mars rover to do. You want your Mars rovers to get into everything. And that's exactly what these children seem to be, doing. And they seem to be using that getting into everything to teach them fundamental things about the causal structure of the world. Okay, I want to just say a few last things about consciousness, which is part of what we're supposed to be talking about here. People have often suggested that babies and even young children aren't really conscious the way that the rest of us are. I want you to think about the looks on the faces of those children that you've just seen in those videos. And I want to suggest, having spent a lot of time looking at the faces of those young children, I want to suggest just the opposite. I want to suggest that children and babies are actually more conscious than we are, more vividly aware of what's going on around them. And I want to suggest this for 3 reasons. What we see, and what I hope I've given you some evidence for, is that there's a kind of functional trade-off for human beings with development. So early in our development, as young children, we seem to be incredibly well designed to learn new things. That's really what we're all about, is about learning new things. We're incredibly bad at actually using our knowledge to do anything. So children can learn 3 languages at once, but they can't tie their shoelaces. They're really, really bad at putting their knowledge to work efficiently and smoothly and automatically the way we adults can. As adults, we're very good at doing things, as Christoph mentioned, really well and expertly and quickly and automatically. We're much less good at being flexible. We're much less good at learning how to do things in a new way. And there's even some neurological evidence for this. So from a neurological perspective, we see these brains that to begin with have potential for massive numbers of connections. And then what happens is the connections that work well get reinforced and the connections that don't disappear. So we have this kind of neurological trade-off between an early brain that's incredibly plastic but not very efficient, and then a developed brain that's very efficient but not very plastic, not very flexible and not as good at learning. So what I want to suggest is that in adults at least, that goes with a kind of phenomenological trade-off. If you think about the experiences that we have as adults that are the most vivid, the ones where we're most aware, it's when we do things like fall in love with someone new or go to a new city that we've never been to before. You go to a new city, especially go to a new city and fall in love, and you'll suddenly find yourself being a baby again, right? You wake up in the middle of the night not being able to sleep and crying, and everything around you seems to have this texture, this vividness, this kind of deep consciousness that you never have when you're just in ordinary life. As an adult, the more automatic, the more efficient, the more straightforward things become, as Christoph also mentioned, the less aware we are of them. The more they just become part of our background knowledge, the less vivid and aware we are of what's going on around us. So I think that actually for babies and young children, every day is first love in Paris. They're constantly in this state of vivid, conscious, determined, focused, attentive awareness that we as adults can only manage on special occasions. But what I want to end with is to say that, so my conclusion about all this is that, yes, they really are scientists, but what I also want to say is that the fact that children are scientists and scientists are children means that science isn't just this specialized thing that a few people do in beautiful places like Caltech. Science is a deep, deep fundamental part of what it is to be human. And those great conscious experiences, that first love in Paris that you could see on the faces of those children chosen at random trying to figure out the gear toy, that consciousness is also the special gift that we have when we do science.